Okay, we might get started. Welcome everybody. I'm joining today from Nipaluna, Hobart, and I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the traditional and enduring owners and custodians of the land that we're meeting on today, and to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal people that are joining us today. So welcome everybody. I know some of you would have joined us last Thursday night at the beach, the briefing on budget night, where we were joined by Minister Street and Minister Barnett. We were able to then provide you with sort of a high-level overview of the budget. We'd spent those 2 hours in the afternoon in the lockup and then back at TasCOSS to try and sort of understand what we saw in the budget to be able to present information on that night. But what we thought we'd do today is just provide an opportunity, now that we've all had a week to digest the budget and start to understand what some of those numbers mean. Just a good idea to have a conversation, and really we really would encourage it to be a conversation, and we're really going to be welcoming questions from you about what we saw, what the numbers mean, what they mean for a community services industry, what they mean for our state. So the format today, it will take, our session will be for about an hour, so we'll finish about 12:30. And as I said, it's a facilitated discussion. In a moment, I'll introduce Professor Richard Eccleston. I'm also joined today by Dr. Charlie Burton from TasCOSS. And we'll be taking questions after we've done a bit of an overview. So when we get to the questions, this is just I'll remind you later, but you can put those questions in either in the chat box or raise your hand and ask those questions yourself, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. The budget briefing, so if you weren't able to attend the budget briefing, that is available on the TasCOSS website, the recording of that, and also we'll be sending out an e-news this afternoon, so there'll be a link to the budget briefing in that, and also the peak summary. So on Friday we sent an email out just with all our peaks across the industry, providing their take on the budget, and we provided that on Friday. If you missed that, again, there'll be a link to that in the e-news this afternoon, and it's also on the TasCOSS website. So in a moment, I'll introduce Richard more fully, but we just thought what we would do is just briefly touch on some of the key sort of highlights and some of the things that we saw in last week's budget, and also some of the things that we were a bit disappointed about and that we were hoping to see more of. So if I could get you to share your screen, Charlie. Fantastic. So the first area was housing, and of course we saw this was one of the big ticket items in last week's budget. 1.5 billion, and this is for 10,000 new homes over the next 10 years, so 1,000 homes per year, social and affordable homes. And this is to Tasmania's ask, and obviously is something that is aspirational, but absolutely necessary, particularly in this kind of current housing crisis that we're experiencing. I guess, as we're all aware of, the record of building and acquisition over the last few years hasn't actually kept up with the targets that have been set. So a really important role for us as an industry is to just be that and be keeping the government to account and tracking those numbers about what's actually being spent and what's actually being built and acquired. And of course, now we have such a significant issue around skilled workforce, but also being able to access materials. So this is going to be more concerning than ever about whether we are able to actually meet those targets and get those homes on the ground. The other thing was safe spaces, so that was increased funding, and that was welcome, but of concern was that funding was only for 1 year. And we saw this in other areas across the industry in the budget, that there were some significant services that are evidence-based and are highly effective, but only getting that 1 year funding. So that obviously is something that we were disappointed to see. Also, shelters, yes, in my backyard program wasn't funded, and we know that this can often be a barrier to homes being built because of the stigma associated with public housing. So we think that's something that would be really help to address some of those issues. In the health portfolio, again, this was the other really big spend in last week's budget, so 11.2 billion over the forward estimates, and this is about an integrated care platform and the upgrade of virtual care technologies, including telehealth, and increased access to community-based care. Apart from that, we didn't see an increase in the preventative health spend, but I guess we just also have to say that it's quite hard to actually get an exact figure on the preventative health spend, but we estimate that it is below the 5% of the overall health budget that we have all been advocating, or many of us have been advocating for over the last 5 years. Let's move on to mental health. So we saw 52 million in mental health for expanded initiatives across, including the implementation of Rethink. I guess one of the things that we heard was missing in mental health was a targeted approach to workforce, especially in funded services. And this was also something that we heard from a number of sectors, that there's no targeted investment in workforce, making sure we've got the people to be able to deliver those quality services to Tasmanians. In disability, there was no significant spend for people with a disability. There was additional funding for the Disability Service Commissioner, and that was welcomed by the sector. And there was also funding for disability organisations, but the spend, really in that area was minimal if you compare it to the spend for the public trustee, which was around 8.6 million. Also, what we heard was disappointing that there was no funding allocated to recognise or compensate the Tasmanians who were impacted by maladministration of the public trustee. And I think this is something that we really need to address as an industry. Let's move on now to family and sexual violence. And there was continued funding for specialist services. And I know that the extension of funding to allow for 5-year contracts was particularly welcomed by this sector. It's something that we would like to see more of right across the community services industry. It's been something that we've all been calling for a long time, and I think really now is the time, with that increased demand for services, where we really need to be ensuring we have those longer-term funding contracts. As with other sectors, there was a real concern about a lack of funding for primary prevention and early intervention. There was no need for more investments to support people who have barriers to accessing services, and this is particularly people who have a disability or people coming from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. The other thing was around the multidisciplinary centres. Although these were welcomed more generally across the sector, there were some concerns raised about the police presence in the centres, and that this could actually be a barrier for people being able to access those services, and this is particularly for Aboriginal Tasmanians or people from the LGBTIQA+ community. Move on to children and young people. There were some positive announcements in this area, but a lot of them were actually re-announcements. I know that Why Not were very happy to see the transition to adulthood program, and they were also pleased to see the Safeguarding Children and Young People funding. There were some concerns we heard raised, particularly about the intensive family engagement services. There was only 1 year funding for this program, and we know that this is a highly effective and evidence-based program, and it really needs to have that surety to continue. And the other one was around the transition from Many Colours, One Direction, 2 million in the budget for this. And that really is not consistent with the recommendations for the transition from this program, and really probably won't be enough. So we really need to be looking at that one as well. Finally, cost of living. And really, I guess one of the things that we talked a lot about at the budget briefing last week, and we were able to have those conversations with Minister Street, was that there were no new announcements around cost of living in this budget, particularly concerning right now when we see food, petrol, housing just absolutely skyrocketing, and really seeing the impact that that's having on people living on a low income. Even in the last couple of days, so there's announcements around the cost of energy about to rise, and that I think we as a community really need to prepare for that. So I think that's something that we really need to be aware of. The only announcements in the cost of living area were announcements that the government's been doing for some time and is agreeing to continue, but obviously nothing new. One of the things that TasCOSS will be doing in the second half of the year is running a series of cost of living forums. So we'll be going around the state asking Tasmanians what they actually need for a good life, and how some of the ways that we can address cost of living issues, particularly in the short, medium and long term. So that's our sort of very broad overview. And I'm now actually going to introduce you to Richard. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Richard, but Richard is the Professor of Political Science and the founding director of the Tasmanian Policy Exchange at the University of Tasmania. He's a specialist in social and economic policy, and in recent years, Richard has worked with numerous governments and led collaborative projects on a wide range of issues, from tax reform, housing affordability, to climate change and energy policy. He was a Fulbright Senior Scholar based in Washington, DC, and was the founding director of the Institute for Social Change at the University of Tasmania. So we're really pleased to have Professor Eccleston join us today, and he's going to start off by just giving us his take of last week's budget, and then we'll open up for questions. So welcome, Richard.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Adrian, and good morning, everyone. It's always a pleasure to work with TasCOSS and colleagues across the community sector. I too would like to acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. But I think we can all agree it's important to go beyond well-intentioned and polite acknowledgements, and to think about genuine action in terms of reconciliation, and especially in National Reconciliation Week. I really like the theme, which is be brave and make change. And I think that's, I guess, a commitment that we all need to make. And I was really heartened by our new Premier, Jeremy Rockcliffe, contemplating changing the day when we celebrate Australia Day away from the 26th of January. So I think that's a sort of practical action that we all need. And thanks also to the TasCOSS team for putting today's session together. There's been a lot happening in politics nationally, and I think that'll be very consequential for the country, for Tasmania, and particularly for the community sector. But today we're obviously focusing on the state budget. They're often fairly dry affairs, a sea of funding announcements and media releases, and then a lot of numbers. But it is important, as I always say to my students, to try to come to terms with the detail, because at the end of the day, we need to be able to follow the money and make sure there is alignment between what governments and our political leaders are saying and the rhetoric and spin, and where they're actually investing resources. And budgets are an important opportunity to do that. It's about a discussion, but I thought I'd just kick off the discussion with, I guess, three sets of observations. Really, one about the context in which this budget has been framed and delivered, and that's important. Some high-level observations about the budget, and then a few, I guess, questions or observations that particularly focus on issues that are of particular importance to the community sector. And Adrian touched on some of those. But I think most importantly, we'd like to get some Q&A happening. So in terms of the broad political and economic context, and there's a cycle to budgets, we're now, well into the COVID recovery and trying to think about what the next normal is. So what budgets right around Australia and around the world are doing is trying to, consolidate, wind in special payments and support measures, as well as health costs, and I guess to restore budgets to some sort of longer term sustainability. And that's a big task, and it's a task here in Tasmania because our analysis bore this out. The Tasmanian government probably provided more COVID-related support to the community and the economy than any other state government in Australia on a per capita basis. So that was part of our, experience, and one of the reasons why we got through the COVID pandemic in reasonably or relatively good shape. The second thing is that this is a second year budget in this current parliament, and usually they're pretty benign, no nonsense affairs, delivering on election commitments and starting to squirrel away some money for an election war chest. So you'd expect it to be pretty benign. But then the unusual context here is we've got a new premier, one who's moderate and compassionate and with a long-standing, commitment, particularly to health and well-being. So to what extent is Jeremy Rockcliffe trying to stamp his authority on this budget? So in that sense, it is an interesting one. My broad assessment is, despite the fact you'd expect that kind of conservative approach and budgetary consolidation, if you start drilling into the numbers, it's actually a reasonably big spending affair. It's actually around $750 million of additional spending over the next 4 years relative to the budget of 12 months ago. But it's also a pretty conservative affair. It's largely about infrastructure spending, and there's not a huge amount of innovation, which is interesting. I mean, the big ticket items in terms of spending are about an extra $120 million a year on health, and a bit over $100 million a year on various state growth projects. In terms of the revenue side, we've got these tax cuts of about $137 million, and they're largely the land tax concessions, which I, along with most, independent analysts and economists, really can't see the merit in doing that. It's going to do very little or nothing in terms of improving housing affordability or stimulating economic growth, and it's $120 million that the state government doesn't have to spend on other services. And I think TasCOSS's advocacy on that at the time was absolutely spot on. The question is, do we need that kind of infrastructure spending, given where we are in the cycle, given supply constraints and labour shortages? I thought it was interesting overnight that Peter Malinauskas, the new Premier of South Australia, actually announced they were reining in their infrastructure spending to invest more money in health and health services, and to get the South Australian budget to surplus sooner. The other broad trend across the states, and particularly acute here in Tasmania, is that slowly but surely health is taking a bigger slice of the government budget, given the costs and the unrelenting demand for health services. A decade ago, it was around 27% of state spending. It's now up to 33%. So that creates a real challenge and crowding out in terms of supporting other programs and priorities in a sustainable way. Final one is that it's increasingly obvious that as the state's tax base becomes narrower and narrower, and we're more dependent on Commonwealth funding, that traditional connection between economic growth, tax revenue, and the amount of money we've got to spend on essential services is almost broken in Tasmania. So while economic growth is really important for investment and employment, and perhaps taking the demand off some of the really important services you provide, we're not getting that trickle down and that revenue coming back into support services. So putting all that together, there's a big challenge in the sense that I think for the first time, certainly since the financial crisis and probably since the 90s, the medium to longer term outlook for the state budget, I think, is increasingly problematic and bleak. There are lots of ways of measuring the deficit. Governments like to talk about just the underlying cash deficit, which is just money in and money out. Most of us that look at budgets tend to focus on the underlying budget balance, which sort of excludes one-off grants from Canberra. But in Tasmania, I think the best way of thinking about the longer term budget outlook is to look at the entire government sector debt, because that also includes the government business enterprises, Tas Water, Hydro, Tas Networks. If we look at that, our overall debt is going to increase from around $4 billion now up to about $10 billion in 2026. So there are big structural pressures there on the budget. That level of debt is almost going back to where it was in the late 1990s. And when you combine that with increasing interest rates, increasing superannuation liabilities, there are certainly some longer term challenges. So there are budget challenges, as we know. There's a lot of economic uncertainty and potential challenges there. And the other sleeper that we need to grapple with is the fact that the concessions that the Morrison government granted to Western Australia in terms of the GST distribution are going to be pushed back to the states from 2026. So that's another headwind there. So big spending, but in fairly traditional areas. But the longer term outlook, is more challenging. So that's going to be, I guess, a constraint that we're all dealing with in terms of revenue, but it also highlights the need for ongoing, structural reform. The idea that we can set and forget and just rely on a growing economy to provide key services is looking increasingly problematic. So, Adrienne, if we've got just a couple of minutes, I was just going to share a few thoughts on specific initiatives and more granular issues. Housing is obviously a key issue and has been for 5 years, and having worked with a number of you on the call on these issues, I think we can all agree that the proposed increased investment in social and community housing is incredibly important, if slightly belated. And as Adrienne mentioned, and as we're all aware, the real challenge is going to be delivering those social and affordable housing in a timely way. The track record's not great. I saw the Greens release on that a couple of days ago, which pretty much aligns with our analysis. That if you look at the number of new affordable homes in the social and community housing sector that actually delivered, they were relatively modest during the early years of the affordable housing strategy. A whole bunch of other sort of demand side incentives, but really what we need is to have a focused investment in the short term on support services and other short-term subsidies to get through this ongoing housing crisis. And have we got the mix of those right? For example, the landlord incentive scheme, probably not an ideal policy, but as a transitional policy, it is one way to alleviate some of the cost pressures on those who are trying to enter the private rental market. What we've always said is there needs to be security tied to that, so perhaps it needs to be a 5-year commitment. Very quickly, cost of living. It's a similar story. These are external and structural factors that are driving up prices. What's the most appropriate state level response? There's a lot of discussion, both in the TasCOSS briefing on Thursday and generally, about what should the state be doing in terms of increasing public sector and perhaps community sector funding to provide wage relief, so we don't have real wage cuts. Given the budget situation, I think that's going to be challenging. But what clearly the short-term focus needs to be is around targeted and short-term concessions. We hope that inflation pressures abate over time, but as we all know, there are really acute pressures there at the moment. This is what most other state governments seem to be doing. In terms of the $305 million on concessions in the state budget, that was really just continuing existing initiatives. It'll be interesting to see, and I think a focus for advocacy is what additional measures is the state government going to implement in the coming weeks and months. Interestingly, in the budget, there is a $100 million contingency fund for unanticipated COVID costs. Given this really is a global cost of living crisis that is affecting low-income households really hard, I think that could be a reasonable use for some of that funding. I've got a long list of other, specific items here that I probably won't go through. We can have a discussion. But given the challenges that we're facing, we've got strong economy, we've got supply shortages, we've got workforce and skill shortages. The one way to reconcile what we're trying to achieve for the Tasmanian community with the broader needs of the economy, I think is really to start focusing on some of those workforce issues. And it really highlights how important those innovative transition to work programs are. And I know that many of you on the call are involved in a number of those programs, as is the university. But when you've got skilled shortages, diminishing potentially resources in terms of providing other support services, we really do need to focus on working with Tasmanians and Tasmanian communities to allow more people to access some meaningful work. So hopefully that provided a few new and broader insights in terms of my take, at least, on the state budget. But I think I'll leave it there and we can open it up for some questions and comments.
That will be great. Thank you so much, Richard. That was really, really helpful and a really good overview about some of the things that you saw. So just a reminder, we're opening up to questions. So you can either raise your hand and you can ask your question yourself, or you can put something in the chat and then we'll ask that of Richard, or Charlie or myself might also be able to provide some answers to that. Richard, I was just curious about your comment about the overall debt and that's likely to, I think, increase from 4 billion, did you say, to 10 billion? I guess I was just interested in that in the context of all the spending that we saw happening over sort of 2020 and 2021, and that the different sort of response that both the federal and the state government were having, one to spending, but two to debt. What's your thoughts about that and where that will kind of lead us in the future?
Happy to answer that. Can you actually hear me? Because I've got a recycling truck outside my office.
We can hear you perfectly.
Look, I'm not a kind of budget hawk. I think that, governments have got to provide services and fund services that support long-term social and economic outcomes. I just think that because of the skewed nature of the Tasmanian budget and our dependent on a diminishing own source tax base, and the fact that over time, federal funding to all of the states is declining, is that's really starting to become an acute issue. And along with other colleagues who were sort of making this point about a decade ago when we're contemplating, reforming the federal system, in a sense, the really strong growth of the last 5 years and then the pandemic obscured these underlying issues, but they're there and they're very real, and they're starting to become evident in the budget papers. So, look, it's only a forecast, but in terms of the fundamentals, Tasmania is heading back into debt. That's okay in the short term, but we need to have that honest conversation about what it means for future generations and what a sustainable, approach is. So that involves thinking about, new models of service delivery to do things in a more effective and coordinated way, and we're all working on that agenda. But there is a broader resourcing question in terms of federalism reform and also, state tax reform.
Absolutely. And interesting to hear your comment about the New South Wales government pulling back on spending on infrastructure and increasing that spend into health.
Yeah, that was South Australia actually, but it's really about reframing the debate about what infrastructure is. And particularly given the suite of responsibilities that state governments have, it's really about building stronger communities and capability in our communities, which is really about social infrastructure.
Yeah.
Treasuries don't like that, because I think about it being capital expenditure, but building capacity in communities, is conceptually similar. And look, I hope that this remains on the agenda, and from we've all worked with with Jeremy Rockcliffe. He is genuinely committed to innovative approaches to supporting long-term community wellbeing. So I think there is an opportunity there to do things differently. But I think the bottom line is we need to.
I mean, we haven't seen much detail around that health announcement, but there is some potential there that could be what that's about.
And knowing how budgets are put together, I mean, a lot of this is kind of locked and loaded well before the change in Premier. So it'll be interesting to see how the next 6 to 12 months play out, because certainly there have been, around some of the really important policy and institutional issues, and there have been some pretty significant announcements from the new Premier.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Question from Charlie.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. That was really great. Sort of two related questions. The first one is, with the Labor government, what are the chances, do you think, of reviewing that GST distribution issue that was made a few years ago, that, if people in the audience don't know, we'll see from 2026 Tasmania receive a much smaller share of the GST than we have been. Up until now, there's a sort of a no worse off guarantee, if you like, that will cease in 2026. Yeah, so the first question is, what are the chances of that decision changing, or at least extending that no worse off deal? And then related, I guess, during COVID, I think the Commonwealth split hospital funding to the states 50-50, and that's reverted back to pre-COVID times. Just wondering again, with the Labor government, is there any chance of some of those sort of federal arrangements changing in states' favour?
Yeah, good and really important questions, Charlie. I was going to say last Saturday night, time's flying. Saturday night 2 weeks ago, election night, was kind of interesting, and lots of surprises. One thing that I didn't see coming was the really strong swing to Labor in Western Australia. Irrespective of what you think about the outcome of the election, that's actually bad for Tasmania, because I think it's officially the top of Saul Eslake's list of the worst economic policy decisions ever. Was this idea to capitulate to Western Australia to effectively underpin their GST distributions. This was a decision made by the previous government in 2018. For 8 years, the Commonwealth, that is all of us as federal taxpayers, underpinned it, and that floor under the Western Australian GST is going to cost us about $18 billion as a country over that period. Then in 2026, the states have got to pick up the tab. So that's going to cost Tasmania between $150 and $200 million a year. Now, will federal Labor be keen to have a rational, evidence-based review of that arrangement? Unfortunately, no, because they will be desperate to consolidate their support in the West. They're dependent on it to maintain majority government. And history shows us that when you have these really large swings, they're very, very difficult to consolidate. And I suspect a big part of the Western Australian vote was partly a protest vote against the Morrison government and the way they treated Western Australia, COVID policy, which is obviously popular in the West. So I think that's a challenge. Will Labor engage in a systematic review of the Federation and funding and the allocation of responsibilities so we have a more rational and efficient and sustainable model? I suspect that might be a second-term agenda. Some people were hoping that, having run a small target campaign, Labor would be more ambitious in government, but I think they've probably learnt the lessons of 2007 and the first Parliament of the Rudd government, and that's unlikely to be the case. But those pressures are mounting. There are solutions, so we need to keep advocating at a state level and nationally for a system that is more equitable and more efficient. And there's a long list of reforms we need to contemplate.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, that makes sense about not wanting to piss off Western Australia in the next 3 years.
I need to be careful. One of my wonderful new colleagues here in the office is from Western Australia, so I've got to tone down my anti-Western Australian sentiment a bit. Apologies to any Western Australians.
Nothing personal.
Nothing personal.
There's a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to go to the second one first because it's just picking up on a figure. Richard, Deb asked the amount that we'll lose in GST from 26, was it 18 million a year, did you say?
Oh, look, there are a lot of variables. Our best estimates of actually, some of you might be aware, actually work on sort of fiscal federalism as a day job. Depending on the relative performance of different states, we're looking at around 150 to 180 million dollars a year. It very much depends on the performance of the Western Australian economy, iron ore prices, and those usual kind of variables. But it's really a material, difference. I mean, between that, debt repayments and superannuation payments, I think we're up to around 400 to 450 million dollars a year of operating expenses that we just didn't have in the budget, 5 or 6 years ago.
Thanks, Richard. And now a question from Mike from Tana, which is you might want to spell it out. I can't remember the trauma network based on the northwest coast. Forgive me, I can't remember the exact the words. Mike asks, Adrienne, you mentioned the budget for preventative health was poor. I believe you said it has actually been less than previous budgets. Mike, we're not necessarily saying it's less. Our calculations in previous budget is it sits at about maybe around 1.5% of the total health budget. We're not saying it's less this year, but it's nowhere near the 5% that comparable countries spend and that the OECD recommends. But Mike's question, is there anything we can do to change this decision, this funding decision, Adrienne, by using collaborative approaches?
Great question, Mike. Yeah, and I know it's something that it's not just TasCOSS, we've been calling on this for some time. I think there's a bit of a conflict around interpretation of preventative health and what we mean when we say that, and we might all mean different things, but I think it's about being really clear about what we mean when we say preventative health and how we can increase that investment. And we heard from a lot of members in different sectors across the industry just what that meant for them, and that there was no increase in investment in early intervention and preventative health.
Can I'll just add to that in terms of opportunities, Mike, there is an opportunity with the Premier announcing just a week or so before the budget that he wants to develop a wellbeing framework. And if you look at other countries around the world, New Zealand, Wales, Scotland, for example, they have wellbeing budgets, and this is an opportunity to introduce a form of budgeting that opens the opportunity to spend more money on preventative health, because you see it in the budget papers. It has the cost benefit kind of outcomes that governments want. Until there's a sort of a budgeting approach to these things, unfortunately, there's, while you've got decisions being made with hospital, ambulance ramping and hospitals under pressure, there's always that temptation to put more money at that acute end. But with a wellbeing budget approach, there may be, it's maybe an opportunity for governments to do the calculations that encourage them to put money more at the preventive end of things.
Thank you. Just really quickly, I'd just like to endorse that. It's challenging to encourage governments to make good investments in the future, and what's the evidence base, but the way to do it is through that long-term community wellbeing framework. And there are lots of building blocks in terms of doing that. I mean, here at the university with colleagues, we're thinking about, and with TasCOSS and others, thinking about what a community, long-term community wellbeing or sustainability framework would look like. An intermediate step that I know a lot of you have been advocating for is the long-term commissioning of services for particular outcomes, and that allows us to really understand and think about the long-term benefits. But it's an ongoing agenda, and it's difficult from a position where the acute end of the health and hospital system, is in crisis, and there's a lot of unmet demand. But the fact is, if we continue down this path and don't try to innovate, the challenge will probably just intensify.
Thank you.
Another question in the chat from Caroline. Do we know the state government is committed to increase community services grants equal to the CPI? Short answer is no.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah, important question.
Yeah.
Adrian, you might want to say a little bit more about this, some of the discussions we've been having with members around indexation. But yeah, like as Paddy's just put in the chat, 2.5% was the indexation in the papers. So nowhere close to CPI.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really significant one, and we certainly did raise it when the Minister was in the room last week, and I think Paddy actually asked a question that addressed this issue. But look, I know that this is a conversation that's also happening in other states, so the causes are sort of working on this across other states. But I think it's a conversation that we also really need to have. We really need to understand more fully the impact of them not increasing CPI, because we have heard from members that the reality is they just can't afford to continue service delivery in the same way, because the costs of delivering services are just growing so much. So yeah, I think it's something that we'll be talking more about over the coming months, definitely.
Question from Sam.
Oh, thank you.
On mute, classic line of, well, beyond 2020, 2022. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so I was particularly interested in the question I think Paddy raised as well last week around cost of living. And yeah, particularly in your comments too, Richard. So obviously the state government have done this both to the public sector and effectively to the community services sector in terms of setting that 2.5 indexation. So obviously when you look at the public sector, that's an industrial conversation. Bargaining occurs. There's precedent for that cap being broken. I mean, bargaining within the sector happens at a level, but if the pool is already conceded at 2.5%, it's much harder to broker solutions and ensure people aren't facing real wage cuts and that services aren't reduced. Is there an opportunity to, in a similar fashion, force, a sector-wide campaign or bargaining approach, probably concurrently with the public sector, to try and effectively smash that cap and, fight it up front, rather than seeing us in a position of facing these tough discussions with each service down the line.
Richard or Adrienne, who wants to tackle that one?
Oh, I'm handling that one to Richard.
Oh, thanks, Sam. A good question. I guess you're right. I mean, there's the industrial issue about wages in the public sector and the community sector. I guess I don't want to provide anyone with kind of advice. I made the observation that, long term, I think the state budget's under pressure, but that's partly because of, historic policy decisions and a lack of reform. I think the sector would be on stronger grounds in terms of arguing for the indexation of funding, so you can continue to provide the services that the community needs and that the government thought it was funding as a first step. So I guess there are three. There's the indexation of grants to reflect costs, and late last night when I was looking through it, I noticed $100,000 to help youth, community sector organisations with fuel bills. Well, that's nice, but I don't think that's going to cut it. There's the targeted temporary increase of concessions that, you know, to try to alleviate or address some of those costs affecting low-income households. And then there's a broader, you know, industrial question around wages, both in the community sector and public sector. So I haven't really answered the question, but, you know, I'd be focusing on the grant indexation and concessions for households.
And in terms of wages, I just add a thought. It's a live discussion, isn't it, at the moment, around certainly wages for the aged care sector.
Yeah.
You know, it's possible that the Royal Commission recommendations, as they hopefully start to get implemented with more vigour by the new national government, you know, let's hope that some movement in wages in the aged care sector might end up rolling through the rest of the industry.
Absolutely.
Right. And I noticed John Kerwin's put in a question. Sorry, Sam?
I was just saying, and of course the national minimum wage increase, which is, I guess, where the rubber hits the road and the problem becomes, because we've had equal remuneration funding to the sector to lift wages over years, which is now, you know, all but expired, and fortunately had the support of all arms of government. But with the expiry lifting of that, I think the pressure on sectors to fund those wage rises inevitably will impact the services they can deliver to Tasmanians, as well as the impact it will have on workers who, you know, may become clients very quickly.
Yeah. And I noticed John Kerwin's raised a question around workforce too, so saying he struggles to see a focus on workforce shortages, reskilling, optimising TAFE, finding housing, short-term contracts, etc., and noting rural and remote face even more challenges. And I think that's a point really well made. Yeah, there's nothing really there about workforce. I mean, we obviously have our community services industry plan, which is broadly about workforce right across the industry, but I know that there were some sectors that were hoping to see some targeted investment in workforce. Yeah, do you want to say anything about that, Richard?
No, I agree completely, and I guess in a slightly vague way, touching on that in terms of this ongoing focus on physical infrastructure and capital investment, when we really need to you know, invest in workforce skills and training, flexible training options that work. And yeah, John, I completely understand that all of those pressures are doubly compounded for RFDS and in regional communities.
I think the other part of that too is, as John mentioned, the housing issue. So with that current crisis, you know, being able to attract new health workers to our state and not wanting to come here because they won't be able to find anywhere to live. So I think that also plays into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I must admit, we sort of thought about housing as being maybe first and foremost a city problem, but particularly during the pandemic, it's become a really profound regional challenge, both with sort of social justice and cost of living and homelessness pressures, but also just in terms of migration and getting workforce. I mean, a housing system that doesn't work is incredibly bad for social outcomes. It's key social infrastructure, but you know, as an economist, it's diabolical for the economy. It impacts where people can live, pushes up costs, and leads to massive debt and instability and inequality. And it's going to be, you know, hopefully with our new Julie Collins as the new Housing and Homelessness Minister and a commitment to a national strategy, we can start to systematically work through these issues. But even under the best case scenario, it's going to take years rather than months.
Yeah. Meanwhile, people are living in tents. Yeah. Do you have any other questions, Charlie?
Just seen one from Patty,
Yeah.
who fully agrees on the importance of housing. Richard, she asks, can you explain any untapped areas of revenue for the state to improve?
The states, yeah, I mean, there's the whole system-wide tax reform, but you know, the best and most efficient and equitable tax bases that states can access are first and foremost land and property taxes. and to provide land tax concessions to investors, as I said, is an incredibly poor, policy outcome, other than a political pitch to property investors. There are other gaps, and I don't want to sort of revisit the wall, but we undertax gaming revenue, for example, in Tasmania. I think in a small jurisdiction, and in terms of some of our work that we've done with the Australian Urban Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, in a small jurisdiction like Tasmania, there is scope to sort of integrate local government rates and property taxes as a stable revenue base, where those who own property contribute, relatively more. All of the economics suggests that this is the most efficient form of tax, because it's difficult to move property assets. So there's clearly a longer-term tax reform agenda, but it also, requires federal leadership as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike completely agrees with you.
I have another question if no one else does. Richard, budget estimates is coming up next week, I believe. This is a time to grill the government and departments on their expenditure and budget decisions. If you had 3 questions you'd want asked in estimates to satisfy your economists and political analysts' brain, what would they be?
That's a good question. I think the big picture question is around the longer term outlook, and whether the government is in fact meeting the targets in terms of the longer term budget strategy, because there has been a significant long term deterioration in the budget, and what that means, for the future, and whether we do need to have an honest conversation around tax reform. In terms of the specific, portfolio questions, it's really about, where is the innovation, and I'm not across all of the details, but certainly the funding commitments around integrated health services and improved investment in primary health and outreach, take some of the pressures off the health system, is good. Also, some of these, I think one thing that certainly I'm very passionate about is a lot of the signature policies the government's talking about really have got pretty modest funding. One that's not perhaps central to the conversation today, but I think very important for longer term wellbeing, for example, is climate and a climate strategy, where the funding there is $10 million to support innovation to decarbonise the Tasmanian economy. Hard to compare states directly, but on that front alone, we're probably spending about 1/5 on a per capita basis to what other states are spending in terms of long-term decarbonisation and adaptation to climate change. So again, it's to what extent is the spending and the resourcing aligning with the stated objectives of the government. My other quick comment on estimates is they kind of seem to be tedious, and I know a lot of colleagues in the public service, lament all of the work they need to do in terms of preparing for them. But just the fact that there is that accountability, that a sharp question might be asked, I think that's really, really important in terms of our democratic system. So that in a parliamentary forum, our governments and ministers and departments, are held to account. Sure, it's usually a circus with, the local media trying to get a gotcha moment, but just the fact that ministers do have to appear before estimates, I think, is a really important part of the integrity of our system.
Thanks, Richard.
Julie.
And a comment from John, again, with the predicted significant impact of the unfunded super liability, when will the government start to use the not-for-profit sector as a partner rather than a backstop? think it's a rhetorical question, but if anyone wants a shot at answering that, go for it.
So now the accountability question, isn't it, John? And local government often ends up in this as well as the service providers of last resort. You know, when there are crises, an acute and rapidly changing need in the community, you know, one of the biggest challenges for organisations is, you know, turning people away and trying to address or meet that kind of unanticipated demand. And if you're just focusing on resources and spending and how much there is in the pot, then you know you often lose track of that kind of you know, those kind of real challenges. And I know you know, for all of the community sector and also for a lot of health professionals, you know, working in the health system, this is a real challenge. And that's right. I mean, at the end of the day, the obligation of accountability, you know, sits with you and your organisations, and it's really tough.
Thanks, Richard. And I notice some people are starting to leave, so I think we will wind up the conversation now. One of the first comments I heard you say, Richard, was follow the money. And I think that's probably a really good thing for us all to take forward. It's one thing having these commitments from our government, but actually what do they mean? And we need to follow them and make sure that we're actually delivering, particularly in these really key areas like housing and health. So thank you so much for your time, Richard, and Charlie as well. But yeah, really appreciate having your insights and expertise and you shining a light on some of the things that we saw happening last week, Richard. So thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. And for anyone on the call who's got any other questions, feel free to reach out. Always keen to try to help.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks everyone for coming. It's been yeah, great. I think it's been a great discussion. Again, e-news will be going out this afternoon, so there'll be links to the last week's budget briefing and the peaks insights, as well as today's recording. So if you want to catch up on anything, please do. If there's any questions that again haven't been asked, as Richard said, you can make contact with him, but please also feel free to make contact with the TasCOSS team and we'll do what we can to answer those questions. Anyway, great to see you all and thanks for joining. Bye.